Sorry. I want you to know that I have been responsible for technical issues on the workshop for many years. And this is kind of a test for people like me, but we usually manage at last. I am Annika Wistedt, and I work in the microbiology lab in Kalmar, Sweden. And I am, together with Giske, going to give you a talk about ATU, Area of Technical Uncertainty, and technical uncertain situation, how to handle them. As you all know, we have all been discussing ATU since about 2019, and ATU has been a part of the definitions in the breakpoint table since the 2019 version. There has been some changes to ATU during 2020 and 2021. And now we think it's very interesting to talk to you about this, since we reckon that you have some experience after implementing these and also experienced the changes. But there has been talks on this issue. In the workshop 2019, there was a talk about ATU, and also there was a webinar last year about ATU. And you could see those talks, you could get a link from the website under workshops and webinars if you want to see those also. We are going to use your mobile phones for Mentimeter questions in the last part of this talk, so please keep your phones ready. And also please use the chat, because this is thought to be an interactive talk with you about those issues you have been working with during this awful times of microbiology in the world. Nice to see you again. So, uncertainty. To handle uncertainty is one of the main tasks in a clinical laboratory. And these are the paragraphs in our quality standards that specify how we need to do that. The laboratory shall consider measurement uncertainty when interpreting, and shall make the uncertainty available to laboratory users. And when the test method precludes rigorous evaluation of
Annika, I'm sorry, this is Annika. We still see the first introductory slide.
Yeah, that's right. So please, you have to actively push it to the next, I think. Yeah.
How come? What do you want me to do?
You have to move to the next with the arrow down, or on the left-hand side, you use the mouse to go to slide number 2.
Oh, this is awful.
No, I don't think it helps like that, because the thing is that you are moving your slides on your screen, Annika, but it's not moved to ours. So I think you're not seeing the same thing as we are on the screen.
Yeah, this is quite possible that it is like this. So
can I recommend that Annika sends her presentation to Christian immediately, and then we can see who of you is first with getting it up.
Maybe we could take the small technical break now while we are doing that, so people have a chance to grab some coffee instead of after this talk. I think that might be a good idea. So we could start again at 10:50 maybe, and then we run the presentation from my computer. That's fine.
Did you get it, Christian? Uses. We thought that we would be over with this kind of technical problems, but I'm sorry I put you into this, and I hope you're now back in place with your coffee. Welcome back. We start where we ended, about uncertainty in laboratories and what the standard says. But in short, this means uncertainty is the only certainty there is, and you will have to deal with it. And what you need to do is to consider uncertainty when interpreting, and you need to be open about this to the clinicians, that you do not have to be necessarily specify the uncertainty in every laboratory report. Just to widen the perspective, uncertainty from the patient's perspective is, of course, a lot of factors, both at the clinic and in the laboratory. And at the clinic, there are problems just to diagnose infection and to make sampling the correct way, or sometimes it's not even possible to make correct sampling. And there's also the delay from the laboratory. In the laboratory, one main problem is, of course, are we working with the correct or the relevant isolate? There are random errors in our methods. There are systematic errors. There can be silent resistance when the isolate doesn't express resistance mechanism in vitro, but still is capable of doing that in vivo. There are heteroresistance where not the whole population would express resistance. And there are mechanism-dependent results, and there are some suboptimal breakpoint for certain species when they are being grouped together. And there are some uncertain clinical correlates between breakpoints and result in treatment. But what we are going to talk about today is only this part of uncertainty in treatment, and it's about susceptible and resistant population overlap in anti-susceptibility testing. And that is what we use ATU for. ATU is defined in the breakpoint table by a single or a short range of MIC values or zone diameters next to or surrounding the breakpoint. ATU warn laboratories of uncertain interpretation where the breakpoint is in a critical place. ATU is not a reporting category. You couldn't put ATU in your laboratory report like you do with S, I, and R. And the laboratory has to choose how to act on the warning. And there are several options and suggestions how to do that in the guidance document. So how do you work when you set an ATU at the UCAST committee? This is an example of Enterobacterialis versus trimetoprim disc. And you see the same kind of graph as those that Annika was sharing just a minute ago. And here's the millimeter values and the correlating MIC for the same isolates in the color shade scale. And this is the dream for the laboratory. As you see, there's a wonderful separation between resistant isolates in red and susceptible isolates in green. And there is also a good correlation between the zone diameter and the MIC. But this is the other way around. This is Enterobacterialis versus Piptazo. And here you could see that for 1 millimeter spot, for example, 19 millimeters, you get isolates with 19 millimeters that get MIC values in the BMD method for all over the scale practically. And this is also very close to the breakpoints, and there's a lot of isolates close to the breakpoints. This is actually not quite true because when you do the calibration and the validation, you use a lot of complicated and hard to solve isolates. So what you see on the right is actually our results during a year with E. coli and Piptazo. And there you could see still it's some isolates close to the breakpoints. It's not a good separation, but there are not too many isolates that behave this badly. It is also interesting to look at the QC range when you look at these graphs. You could see that the whole, almost the whole native population, the susceptible population, is built up by method variation, because this is the same variation as you get when you use the method for one control strain, or if you use it for a lot of strains, susceptible strains in your laboratory. Obviously, we need an ATU for Piptazo and Enterobacterialis. And in this year's version of the table, this is only 1 millimeter range, and it's the 19 millimeter range. And this is absolutely close to the breakpoint in the resistant area. So the interpretation of 19 millimeters will be R. In earlier versions, there were an I category for this combination, but it has now been removed. And then the interpretation will be much easier. Why is this combination that bad as it is? There are some obvious reasons. Of course, it's a combination drug where diffusion on agar wouldn't be exactly the same way of presentation of the antibiotics to the bug as it is in broth. And it also possible that the resistance mechanism, for example, exceeding or high beta-lactamase expression would be expressed in very different ways during different conditions and in different isolates. So there could be a continuous scale of more and more resistance. So to decide on the ATUs, UCAST take in consideration if there's agreement between disk diffusion and broth microdilution, which is the reference method. They also take in consideration reproducibility in the reference method itself, and if there's a possibility to check agreement with a molecular method, it's of course used. Some false resistance may be the cost to avoid false susceptibility in the system. And UCAST also tries to limit the total number of ATUs. And what has happened is also that defining the ATUs has led to some revisions of the actual breakpoints. Have you something to add here, Erika?
No, I think you summarized it very well. Thank you.
So, which are the current ATUs in the breakpoint table of this year? It is only defined in 4 of the total 29 species sheets in the table. So there are only ATUs defined for Enterobacteriales, Staphylococcus, Pseudomonas, and Haemophilus influenza, but only for Haemophilus influenza that are PBP3 positive. What you need to be aware of, as you all know, you have to be very meticulous when you look in the table to interpret the values correctly. As for example, here with cefotaxime and Haemophilus influenza, you know that the S figure represents equal to or above the actual figure. That is for cefotaxime and Haemophilus, 27 and above is susceptible. And the resistance figure is presented as below. So here 26 is of course resistant. The ATU, on the other hand, is presented as an interval. And that means that in this case, both 25, 26, and 27 is included in the ATU area. And that means that 25 and 26 is defined as resistant and within ATU, and 27 as within the ATU but susceptible. The ATUs could be defined for disk diffusion or MIC or both. Here are the ones that are defined for MIC highlighted, but most of the ATUs only apply to disk diffusion. And as I pointed out, it is also very different if the ATU would cover the SR area, the I area, or the R resistant area. And there are also mixed areas that are defined as ATUs. So how should these results be reported when you end up in ATU? Earlier on, we used the letter I to report this to clinicians, and the I definition was full of different meanings, like uncertain effect, uncontrolled errors, you should increase exposure of antibiotics, or this could work in special infection focus. But now the letter I could only be used to the meaning of increased, susceptible with increased exposure. And the task is now to solve the ATU results rather than communicate them. And for your help is the guidance document on the UCAST website, and you could find it under the AST of bacteria guidance documents. And in very short, there are 7 options to use, and there are also detailed descriptions for the different combinations which could be preferred. And the options are: repeat the test. If you think that you have quality problems, that could be an option. You could perform an alternative test, and that could be if there is an alternative test that has good quality. You could report as uncertain and include the interpretation, or you could hide the interpretation and make comment about uncertainty. You could downgrade the result to an R, or you could take the opportunity to discuss the results with a clinical colleague. Or you could just ignore the warning and interpret in accordance with the actual breakpoint. Then I think we should turn to the Mentimeter questions. Ulrik, would you please share your screen?
Yes.
Annika, I think you need to unshare before Ulrik can share.
Done.
Now it's fine.
Okay. I guess you already have this question on your screens. And we go through some examples, and the alternatives are going to be the same for every clinical situation. As you could see, I have omitted the alternative of talk to the clinician, because in this situation, we say that we have already talked to the clinician and we got some information. And this is the information for the first case. There is an E. coli that grows in blood culture. Piptazo ends up in 19 millimeter. That is inside in the resistant part, according to the breakpoint, and it is in the ATU area. And when you talk to a clinician, he says that this is an unknown focus, but Piptazo seems to work successful for the patient. And now you could start, choose what would be your alternative to do. And we'll wait for you to do that. Would it be to repeat the test, to find an alternative test, to report result and comment on uncertainty, downgrade to resistant, or ignore the warning, report as found?
It seems like maybe it has stopped now.
I will show the results.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a clear majority for use an alternative test. And I guess that what you do use at that point, what would that be? That would be a gradient test or a BMD. So you make the clinician wait for your result. When you choose that alternative, it's going to take 1 night more. And do you have something to say about choosing the gradient test, Christian?
Yes, I think that is an option which is a bit dubious. I mean, it has been redeveloped, so perhaps it's performing slightly better, but in this tricky area, I think still that might be a bit problematic. Perhaps Annika would like to comment more on how the gradient tests perform in this range. But personally, I would definitely advocate primarily to go with broth microdilution in a situation where you need to, where you choose to test with another method. But please feel free to comment here, Annika, based on the experience with the redeveloped gradient test.
Yes, I would say that I mainly agree with, or my main conclusion would be that an alternative test, a reliable alternative test should be broth microdilution for piperacillin tazobactam. A couple of years ago, we detected quality problems with piperacillin tazobactam gradient tests. And we had a warning on the UCAS website, and both bioMérieux and Liofilchem has since then redeveloped their tests. So they are better. One problem with the pip-tazo was it was a bit different from what we saw with benzyl penicillin and Streptococcus pneumoniae. And for pip-tazo, results could be either too high or too low. So it was a bit more random than a systematic deviation. So the redeveloped tests works better, but it's in our experience, it seems like when you have a beta-lactamase inhibitor in a gradient test, it is a bit more sensitive because you need diffusion of both agents, and the tazobactam should be fixed at 4 milligrams per liter over the gradient. So I think it's a bit difficult to develop those tests properly, actually. And even if there's no warning on the UCAS website, I would say that I would rather trust the disk diffusion test here than to perform a gradient test. And if we would perform an alternative test, that would be broth microdilution.
On the other hand, yes, so if we decide to go with the R, you mean, I think it's also important to emphasize for the clinician that it might be fine.
Yes.
To
Absolutely,
continue with
absolutely.
the treatment that has been given, and that it's very tricky in this area to. So I think if we report it as R, many will probably switch treatment in that circumstance. So
I mean, one option would be not to report S or R, and just to have a comment that this is just, it's very borderline. But maybe if they have a success, they shouldn't avoid pip-tazo for further treatment.
There is also the problem with the alternative test. Even if you turn to BMD, you could end up in the ATU area for BMD, which is 16. So maybe you wouldn't solve your situation.
I would say that we have chosen to treat for example, for Enterobacterales in pip-tazo and for Enterobacterales in ciprofloxacin, where there is also an MIC ATU, that if you have a result that where you have the same categorization with both methods, we would trust that one. So for E. coli and ciprofloxacin, for example, could be either S, I, or R, and the I category is the same as the ATU. But if both disk diffusion and broth microdilution gives a result in the I category, we would trust that result because we have the same result from two methods.
Would that apply for gradient tests too, you think?
I think so, yes.
So that could be a solution.
Yeah.
Are there any other comments on this one?
There are some in the chat now about what other options there are if BMD is not available in your lab, and some made a comment that there are BMD from Merlin in strips that can be used in small labs in citation marks. I don't know if we have any experience with the BMD from Merlin, Erika.
We do, but only for colistin. But it's
Yes.
a very user-friendly method that can be implemented for just the specific antimicrobial agents. Actually, also Liofilchem, who manufactures the MTS, they have a broth microdilution test also. It's called COMASP, and they have a test for Piptazo, also very user-friendly. You will get the broth, everything that you need in the same kit. So I think that all these are better options, but of course, as with all method that you use and whatever broth micro method you use, also you have to perform the quality control and check that the results are as expected. And for Piptazo, you have to check both with a susceptible QC strain and an ESBL producing strain to control both the piperacillin and the Tazobactam in your test.
I think that, yeah.
Please, Christian.
No, I think there was someone who was trying to say something. I don't know. Well, okay. So basically, this also doesn't tell a lot about what the other options are. So if there are plenty of other treatment options, maybe it could be worth considering switching to something else if that has no clear disadvantages. And of course, playing it safe here would be to report it as R, which would be technically correct. The only disadvantage of that is if that significantly impacts the treatment in a broader direction, and the treatment seemed to work successfully, whatever that means. And that could, of course, also be questioned to which extent that is really true, or whether it was even a borderline response here. But finding out more about the overall antibiogram and the implications of the decision is, and I think many labs would maybe not have the capacity to do BMD or the time or energy to do it. And of course, reporting this as R is not at all incorrect, but might be advised then to add a comment that it's on the border, and that we cannot exclude also that there could be a possibility of continuing to use the drug. So, but these situations are a bit tricky indeed, and it's just a very tricky drug that was originally developed with a too low Tazobactam concentration, and that has come back to bite everyone several times, and is also of course a problem from the testing perspective.
I think what you do when you report this as resistant, what often will happen is that you ease up the change to a peroral treatment. Maybe it's going to be changed to ciprofloxacin if it's susceptible. I also saw that Lisa Heldahl asked, could you clarify about the gradient test? And I think that you actually said, Erika, in this special situation, if it's in the same category, it could be used as some support for the interpretation, if it's the same as disk diffusion. But it's not better than the disk diffusion. It's just another test.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's important.
I had a comment.
Yep.
I don't think we should make it too difficult for people, because, as you said, not everyone can do broth microdilution. I think it's important to remember that whatever test you're using, you take responsibility for the QC of that test, and that goes for gradient tests as well. To just repeat the test on an ATU, which consists of 1 single millimeter, will statistically automatically result in a different result. So you will have either 18 or 20. So that's not going to help you. It will give you a different result, but it's not going to be any better from a quality point of view. Repeating the test and adding a gradient test, I think, is a good way forward, provided you have some quality control measures in place for the handling of the gradient tests. So I think the right answer here is to say, if it's important, you should repeat the test and add a gradient test if you don't have access to broth microdilution. If it's not important, because there are many very good alternatives, then you can just report an R and say that's how your result was interpreted. And you just have to know that the next day the result might actually be S, and you might want to add a comment to that effect.
Yeah, I think adding some comment that it's on the border and that the testing is difficult is a good idea, and of course having a verbal dialogue with the treating clinician. But I think we can say we do not advise to do gradient tests. So if you don't have broth microdilution, the right answer would be to downgrade, but maybe to add a verbal and possibly written comment on the difficulties.
Yeah, now you had two options to choose between, Christian and Gunnar. Should we choose to the next step, maybe?
Wait a second, because there was the second part of Lisa's question that I don't think that we managed to answer, and that is that does these with ATU and the problems with gradient test, is that only for pip/tazo, or do that pertain other drug box combinations as well?
I think that pip/tazo is the one we have most information on, and for some of the others we don't know. For Pseudomonas and colistin, we know that the gradient test shouldn't be performed at all. It cannot be trusted. So there we only have broth microdilution as an option. For Staphylococci, ceftarian, and ceftobiprole, actually we don't know how reliable the gradient tests are, because we don't have that data.
Okay, we have 4 left, and I think it's a good thing to try to get through these 4 that are left. The next one is about Pseudomonas in a blood culture, and it's also pip/tazo, and it's also 19 millimeters. But in this case, it's susceptible increased exposure and within ATU. All other alternatives for this isolate is I or S, and clinician says this is an unknown focus. We treat the patient with pip/tazo. So what would you do in this situation? Please go ahead. I think Gunnar asks if this was a rapid test. It isn't.
A regular, yeah.
A regular test. We had the signal late in the afternoon, so it's early in the afternoon. It's a regular test in a small laboratory.
Just to clarify, the comment that Gunnar is putting on is a response to a previous comments asking if the previous result could come from a non-correct Macfarlane, and if you use the correct Macfarlane, that would increase quality. And obviously, we always need to have the right Macfarlane when we are judging these things here. So I think this is what Gunnar was answering on.
Yes, it was correctly carried out from technical perspective, AST.
Yeah, I think just to say that none of what we're discussing now has to do with the ATU you might end up in RAST. This is all regular AST, is that right, Annika?
Of course, yes. RAST has their own ATUs. And here comes the results. Okay, there's a slight change towards report result and comment on that. And the alternative test has lost some of its speed in this situation. Well, that's it's hard to say. Should you use a designated interpretation where you say this is susceptible, and just comment what you say about that, Christian? Do you find it risky or not?
Yes, I think it's risky with Pseudomonas. It's Piptazo is borderline active, I would say. So it's also a situation where you have to consider definitely dosing 4 times daily. And if the patient is severely ill, also extended infusion. And if you feel uncertain about the result here and there are other treatment options, I would be very careful about stretching it too far. But again, it depends on, now you're listing here that the other options are I or S. So in that situation, I would be quite careful about reporting Piptazo in a blood culture with Pseudomonas.
Yeah, you would downgrade to R, to resistant, or?
That depends a little bit on what we had access to, but probably in practice, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Any comments on this, or could we choose the next one? The next one is about E. coli and ciprofloxacin in urine culture, and here is an I and ATU result. It's an ESBL isolate with all other per-oral options interpreted as resistant. And clinician thinks they are treating a pyelonephritis with ciprofloxacin. What do you do as your first option? Is there anything from the chat that we should talk over? Robert, do you think, while people are choosing?
No, it's all we're all with on the chat at the moment, so I'll keep an eye on this all the time.
Thank you. So these sessions are so much more fun when you could talk to each other during waiting. Now it's more suitable for a workshop, actually. And we miss you all. We were talking about having chat rooms where you could talk to each other, but there were objections to that from a certain country, I would say. Could we show the results now, Ulrik? Okay, here's the majority for alternative test again, and I guess that has to do what you were commenting on with Piptazo. Maybe one could use a gradient test here, and if you end up in the I category, you could report as susceptible increased exposure. Or what do you say, Christian?
I'm not sure we have a lot of data on the gradient test for ciprofloxacin. I think we would again then need to ask if there is some experience with that, but in EDL, but I think maybe we have not really investigated this to a larger extent.
What we actually, there is some data, but it's mostly for Salmonella species.
Yeah.
At the time when we developed the pfloxacin disc screening test for Salmonella and fluoroquinolones or ciprofloxacin, there was also a lot of work performed in the USA at the same time at some other labs. And one of those labs looked quite carefully into gradient tests or E-test for ciprofloxacin and levofloxacin. And it actually looked pretty well for the Salmonella. So we don't have that same signal as we have for piperacillin tazobactam. And again, I would say that, as we said for pip-tazo, if you get a result within the I category with the gradient test and the disk diffusion test, yeah, then you have two methods showing the same result. If you have the possibility to perform a broth microdilution, that is still the better option.
Yeah, this might be an option. I think we should remember here that this is from urine and not from blood. Also, there are limited other treatment options. So otherwise, we are probably skewing it either towards something which might not be even properly licensed for pyelonephritis, or even to some IV treatment outside of hospital. So here, I think it's important to report something in this particular situation. And also the urine breakpoint is pretty conservative. So perhaps the best option is to go with another test that you have access to and see if it gives you the same result as the previous one. But it's still tricky, since we don't have tests that are very easy to use, that are also highly reliable. But I think personally, from a clinical point of view, probably it would be worth trying to treat this one with an oral drug if possible.
Do you want to comment on increased exposure in the urine culture?
Yes, indeed, there is an increased exposure here, and we have to maybe consider that this patient possibly got intravenous treatment initially. We of course don't know that from the case, but if this is a step-down treatment, then there is even less worry, I think, about using it. If this would be the initial treatment when you have a high inoculum and everything, I would be more worried about going there without having gone into IV treatment initially and feeling certain that the bacterial inoculum is reduced. But certainly there's very high concentrations of ciprofloxacin in the urinary tract, and most likely these criteria we are using, which are adapted to all infections, are more adapted to systemic infections than to urinary focus, where you can probably fairly safely treat isolates such as this one due to the high urine concentration.
Let's go to the next one. This is about a Staphylococcus epidermidis in a blood culture. Cefoxitin is 27 millimeters, and that places the isolates in the susceptible category and inside the ATU area. And the clinician says when you talk to them that this is a possible endocarditis. What do you do? The same alternatives as before. Maybe this could be slightly faster. What do you think, Ulrik? Yeah. Here there is a safe option as an alternative test. In this area, you are advised to use a MEC PCR to check on this before reporting if it's critical treatment. So that is what you should do. I think here is a correct alternative, and that's the alternative test. Any comment on that?
No, I fully agree with this. I forgot to say on the previous one that with ciprofloxacin, we are looking into some options for urinary focus. So there is some ongoing work in UCAST with that. For this one, I fully agree that the MEC testing is indicated.
Yeah, I try to open to that, but we take that next time, Christian. So let's go to the last slide. This is an Haemophilus from upper respiratory tract. It has a PVP3 mutation, and the cefotaxime ends up in 27 millimeters. That is susceptible and ATU, and clinician says this is an adult febrile patient, and maybe he has pneumonia, and we are treating him with cefotaxime. I would like to add. What would you do? Okay. Here's a majority for alternative tests. The problem is what to say to the clinician, what to do when you wait for the alternative test. Should you play safe or not?
I think, again, this is a very conservative break point, so I would feel fairly comfortable saying that with the PK/PD, you could continue with cefotaxime in this situation. And it would be expected that there would be a clinical response. So I would not have a concern in continuing. Had this been instead meningitis or something, then it's a different story. But for this indication, I would definitely not feel that we need to advise to use something else while further investigating it. Please feel free to disagree if someone thinks otherwise.
What about the chat, Robert?
The chat is absolutely there. Came one here now which says, would there be a better treatment option for pneumonia instead of using cefotaxime?
Well, there are, of course, other things one could consider, like fluoroquinolones in this situation, or as someone mentioned here, piptazo is another option. So that's definitely something that can be tested fairly easily as well.
But
So
is it high risk that when you end up in ATU for cefotaxime, you're close to ATU with piptazo?
Yes, but some of these mutations do not always affect piptazo too much. So it might actually be an option to look into that. But I would at least personally not be worried about this one potentially falling into R if it's a pneumonia.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that was the last one. And we could start the next one if you change to the next slide, Ulrich, but I think we don't wait for you. You could vote for the next one when you take your lunch. And when are we going to be back again?
Well, we are not having lunch just yet because we have one more presentation.
Sorry, it's a break now. Yeah.
No, there is no break.
We already had that one. That's my.
Yes, we already had the break, so there's a new presentation.
Thanks to me, we already had a break. So maybe we just change screen and show this later on if there's time.
Yes, we can do that. So I think what we could do now is first I would like to ask